It's my privilege to introduce our speaker today. It's Cory Peacock. We welcome him here. And let me say a couple of words about who he is and what he does. Cory Peacock has a Ph.D. from New York University. His Ph.D. in Hebrew Bible in particular, so he's an expert in literature of the Old Testament and ancient Near East. And his dissertation was on the Akkadian loanwords in the Hebrew Bible. But in addition to that, he also does research in some other related topics. He has contributed to quite an interesting project, the Beyond Suffering Bible, which is the study Bible that has to do with people who experience some traumas or suffering and who seek encouragement. So he's one of the contributors to this study Bible. He has taught a number of graduate and undergraduate courses in New York and in other places. And currently, he also works on a range of topics, which include the necessity of humility in biblical studies, a life of faith, that is practical Christianity in a way, and also theology of play. He has served in church in different capacities, and interestingly, he's married to Amy Jacober, who is also going to be with us probably another day. We welcome Cory in our summer school, and thank you for having agreed to participate. And we're looking forward to your topic, which today is going to be the under-reading or over-reading in Leviticus, or probably you change your topic a little bit. I'm not sure about that, but thank you for your willingness to talk, and I welcome you, and you may now take the floor from me.
Thank you very much. It is early morning where I am here at the moment, so I would like to wish you a good morning or good afternoon for you. As he said, my name is Cory Peacock, and I am a scholar of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, and so I may use these terms interchangeably in this time. And if you would permit me, I'd like to tell a brief story about why I am sitting here right now. When I was growing up, I belonged to a Christian Protestant denomination known as the Salvation Army. And they are part of the Wesleyan Arminian tradition, like the Methodists. This denomination had a rather robust program in place for young people to go on summer-long mission trips, to meet brothers and sisters around the world, to help in places far from home, and to learn about the worldwide church. In 1992, as a young man, I was selected with 11 other young people to go to Russia for the summer. My team went to Moscow for 1 week, but then we were, much to our surprise, sent to Ukraine. And so I ended up spending 11 weeks that summer, that year, in Kiev and Yalta. I helped as much as I was able at the time. I learned a lot. And I had a beautiful summer in Ukraine. And since that time, I have always had a soft spot in my heart and always will for Ukraine. One lasting lesson that I learned was how important our translators were that summer. I realized that my monolingual, English-speaking team of young and enthusiastic Christians were absolutely helpless without someone whose role was to serve as a mediator between people speaking different languages. So I would like to express right now my deep appreciation for our translators today. Thank you. In learning how important our translators were, I also wanted to explore the idea of language as a phenomenon. I wanted to study linguistics, though I didn't know that's what it was called at the time. I studied linguistics in college, and then I went to seminary and then graduate school, where I received my Ph.D. from New York University in Hebrew Bible, focusing heavily on language and its usage between people of different cultures in the ancient world. In some ways, then, I chose the course of my entire professional life because of that summer in Ukraine of 1992. So, if you appreciate what I am offering at this time here, I am truly grateful to the Christians of Ukraine for their role in my journey. If you do not like what I'm offering here today, you only have yourselves to blame. The final part of this story is that I was asked recently to step in and fill this slot. And while disability is not my primary area of expertise, I am fortunate to be married to a scholar of theology and disability who will be presenting to you later this week. I am honored to be here, and I thank you for your time. So, now on to the task at hand. Why Leviticus? Why do we base our investigation of disability within the Hebrew Bible in Leviticus? Well, frankly, there's not much else to investigate. There is, of course, some, and as you saw the titles of other presentations that will happen this week, there are some other places to investigate, and I am grateful that other people are grabbing those topics. But in general, there's not much, at least not much explicitly. There are, of course, several stories within the Hebrew Bible that feature protagonists with disabilities of various types. Isaac, son of Abraham, was blind, or nearly so, in his old age. Jacob, son of Isaac, limped after his encounter with the angel of God. Moses, son of Amram, stuttered, or in his own words, he was slow of speech and tongue. And Moses relied heavily on his brother Aaron. Ehud, the judge, according to the Targumim, had a shriveled hand, though this is not clear in the biblical text itself that this was so. And Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, did not have full use of his legs. Those are the primary examples we see of disability in the Hebrew Bible. There may be other examples, but those rely heavily on interpretation of textual clues. You may have noted that I included Ehud in this list, who is not clearly identified as having a disability in the biblical text, but was thought to have one by the rabbinic interpreters of Scripture. Even so, the condition of each of these characters in the Bible is mentioned, but not unpacked. We are not told how to feel about these disabilities or whether they should be treated in a specific manner. Mostly, their respective conditions are thought to be something that was overcome in some fashion during the course of their story. Leviticus is one of the few places in the Hebrew Bible that explicitly acknowledges disability and suggests a response to it. We will read, quite literally, everything Leviticus has to say about it soon. First, though, let's understand a few things about Leviticus itself. Leviticus is the third book in the Hebrew Bible. As part of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, this section is known as Torah. For anyone who knows about the sources that went into the composition of Torah, Leviticus is written primarily by someone or a group of people that modern scholarship has identified as the priestly source, or P for short. And this is because the P source is largely concerned with the priests of Israel and the religious aspects of Israel in relation to her God. How to worship, when to worship, and what to do in preparation for worship. This is in comparison to the other sources of Torah, whose concerns are certainly focused on who to worship, that is, Yahweh, and and what the character of Yahweh is, and Yahweh's relationship to Israel and her ancient forebears. We know Leviticus is heavily focused on priestly things because, well, its overall content. But we also note that one of its primary names in Hebrew is Torat Kohanim. The first word, Torat, is often translated as teaching. And the second word, Kohanim, is priests. The question is then, is the teaching for the priests or is the teaching of the priests? That is, priestly teaching for others? Well, it turns out to be both. The first 16 chapters of Leviticus focus on the teaching for the priests. How should one exist as a priest in Israel? What are the standards for being a priest? What does one do in the practice of worshiping Yahweh, ranging from what to eat to when and where and how to offer sacrifices? The first part of Leviticus is a virtual manual of how to be a priest in ancient Israel. The final 11 chapters, from chapters 17 through 27, are known as the Holiness Code. This is occasionally shorthanded as simply H. And as Jacob Milgram writes, with chapter 17, the verbal and ideological scenery of Leviticus changes. We have entered the domain of H, the holiness chapters. Two critical changes occur. Ritual impurity becomes moral impurity, and the domain of the sacred expands, embracing the entire land, not just the sanctuary, and all of Israel, not just the priesthood. So Milgram advocates for an understanding of the second half of Leviticus as opening the doors of the temple and insisting that all of Israel be holy and all of Israel's land is a sacred space. Now, even according to Milgram, this would be a little bit of an overstatement. The holiness chapters continue to cover ritual purity. Furthermore, there are two of these chapters that are almost exclusively concerned with the priesthood and not all of Israel. But Milgram's point stands. The calculus has shifted towards a greater concern for ethical holiness in this section, rather than a mere concern for ritual purity and holiness. And to put a fine point on this discussion, we should note that both references to disability in Leviticus occur in the holiness chapters of Leviticus. So, we turn our attention now to the two parts of the title in this presentation: underreading and overreading. What do I mean by this? Well, overreading is a fairly common term in English, which means to pull out too much meaning from a text. Another way of saying this in English is for someone to read too much into something. One example, you may have seen this situation before. A nice young lady is kind and polite to a young man of a similar age, for no other reason than she is kind and polite. But the young man interprets this, or you might say misinterprets this, as her interest in him in a romantic way. Plenty of movies are based on this very scenario. This is a classic case of reading too much into something someone says, or overreading the text. Underreading, on the other hand, is simply my way of saying, what is the opposite of overreading? It is when someone should read more from the text than what is being written or said on the surface. My wife and I experienced this numerous times. While she and I are sitting on the couch at home, reading perhaps, she will turn to me and say, "It sure is hot in here, isn't it?" To which I will reply, "Yes, it is." But she's not really telling me that it's hot. She's really saying, "Hey, buddy, will you please turn on the fan because I would like to cool off." In this scenario, I took her words at the surface level, when I clearly should have understood that there was more to understand. That is underreading. So then, who is underreading and why, and what's the problem? Well, I won't name names, but one example of this is one of the several articles I read addressing Leviticus 19:14, and many of them all engage the deaf and the blind too simplistically or too literally. Leviticus 19:14 reads, it's just one verse, "You shall not curse a deaf man, nor place a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall revere your God. I am the Lord." Of course, the scholars are not taking this verse so literally as to think that Leviticus is only referring to deaf men. They recognize that this is a reference to any deaf person. But their discussion does not lead one to believe that Leviticus has anything else in mind beyond literal deafness and blindness. One article relies upon the fine scholar Saul Olyan and his extensive analysis of disability in the Hebrew Bible. And this scholar seems to misapply the general statement in connection with this verse. Olyan writes, quote, "Defects are typically devalued in biblical discourse. Their negative construction is made manifest through the text's effort to stigmatize and marginalize those who possess them." End quote. So in this case, even when Israelites are encouraged to treat the deaf and blind ethically, some read this as merely due to the stigma inherently attached to them throughout the Hebrew Bible. Why are these scholars misreading this passage? I believe it is out of a sincere effort to read the text honestly, but I am also inclined to think that this is a misunderstanding of genre. Due to the formal and formulaic nature of Leviticus, they may have mistaken this holiness material, which is largely ethical advice in this section, for legal material because of that formulaic and formal nature. Legal material is generally exhaustive. Legal material seeks to lay out all, or at least most, of the possibilities so that appropriate judgments might be made depending on the infraction that has occurred. Exodus contains many examples of this. Let me quickly shorthand Exodus 21, verses 1 to 6. This is my paraphrase. "If you buy a slave, he shall serve for 6 years. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If his master gives him a wife, the wife and kids stay, but the slave goes. But if the slave says, 'I love my master,' then the slave stays." This is one abbreviated example of many where legal materials look to cover all its bases. My favorite example of this appears later in Exodus 21. That is in verses 28 through 32. These are known as the goring ox laws. And I won't read that here, but these laws attempt to be so comprehensive in covering all the possibilities that the laws cease to be logical, or at least they cease to be logical on the surface level. Most biblical legal scholars would argue, though, that even legal material is not as exhaustive as it would appear on its surface. Rather, even legal material requires one to extrapolate from examples, from the written precedent clearly articulated in the text. One other way of knowing that this is not legal material, too, is the text itself. This whole section is emphasizing the ethical behavior that Israel should aspire to. And this verse concludes with, "I am the Lord." That is, the text acknowledges that someone could do these things, and there is no legal proscription against it. Yet, even if there were, it would be easy to get away with such behavior in the eyes of men. But the verse concludes, "Be reminded, Israel, I am the Lord. I see your behavior, and I know your heart." This is not legal material, it is ethical advice. And Israel is meant to be pure and ethical as Yahweh is ethical. Leviticus 19:2 reads, "Speak to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." So the problem with underreading, as we see in verse 14, is the misconception that deafness and blindness encompass the whole of Levitical recognition of disability. And thus, we would be left with a sort of agnosticism regarding disability in ancient Israel. So how should we read this? Returning to Milgram, Milgram states, the Holiness Code's, quote, penchant for generalizations favor a broad definition: insult, abuse, ridicule. Indeed, it is hardly conceivable that the Holiness Code literally meant that one is forbidden only to place a stumbling block before the blind. To draw this example out to a fuller extent, surely the Holiness Code was not merely concerned with insulting the deaf, but approved of insulting the blind. Clearly, it is not the case that stumbling blocks were verboten, but tripping the blind with sticks was acceptable. The verb used in this sentence is kuf lamed lamed, the Hebrew letters kuf lamed lamed, to insult, but literally it means to treat lightly. And this is in direct contrast to the Hebrew word whose root letters are kaf, bet, dalet, to honor or respect, but literally as part of a root that means heavy. To treat the deaf lightly is not to take them seriously. It is to not treat them with respect. As Baruch Levine writes, speaking ill of the deaf is especially reprehensible because it is taking unfair advantage of another's disability. And certainly, the early in the rabbinic tradition, the stumbling block was considered a metaphor, much as it is today, for not preying on another's weakness. I am also struck, again, as were many ancient rabbinic interpreters of Scripture, by the similarity of this two-part list to other two-part lists using the rhetorical device of merism. In English spelled M-E-R-I-S-M, merism. We see, for example, in Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This two-part list of heavens and earth rhetorically suggests that God created all of existence, not merely the skies and heavens and the ground. Often, the parts of these two-part lists are literal opposites, and sometimes they are merely disparate elements in a bigger list of possibilities. Much like the English phrase used to begin events, "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen." Implied in that statement is a welcome for everyone who is in attendance. So here we have the Holiness Code utilizing the blind and the deaf to represent all those with ailments that makes them easier to be taken advantage of by others. In fact, this is the very subject of all the verses that follow verse 14 in chapter 19. Do not oppress your neighbor. Do not withhold wages from a hired man. Do not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. And is part of that larger list for the ethical concern for widows, orphans, and the foreigner in our midst. Let us now turn our attention to overreading. I think a bigger problem than underreading is overreading in this case. After all, even if one reads Leviticus 14 too literally, it still is generally positive, saying, "Be good to these people whom you could easily take advantage of. Don't make their lives difficult." Leviticus 21, verses 16 through 24, presents a much bigger challenge. And I'm going to read the entire set of verses here. Won't take long. Verse 16. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron, saying, no man of your offspring throughout their generations who has a defect shall approach to offer the food of his God. For no one who has a defect shall approach, a blind man, or a lame man, or he who has a disfigured face, or any deformed limb, or a man who has a broken foot, or broken hand, or a hunchback, or a dwarf, or one who has a defect in his eye, or eczema, or scabs, or crushed testicles. No man among the descendants of Aaron the priest who has a defect is to come near to offer the Lord's offering by fire. Since he has a defect, he shall not come near to offer the food of his God. He may eat the food of his God, both of the most holy and of the holy. Only he shall not go in to the veil or come near the altar because he has a defect, so that he will not profane my sanctuaries. For I am the Lord who sanctifies them. So Moses spoke to Aaron and to his sons and to all the sons of Israel. The scholarly article that caused me to stop in my tracks wrote the following. And it was speaking of Leviticus, and it says, speaking of Leviticus, it appears to state, quote, the diseased, the damaged, and the disabled are prohibited from God's presence. The implication of this is that disability itself is contrary to God, end quote. And this author was using this statement to criticize Leviticus and its perception of disability. My heart broke at what I took to be a misreading, an overreading. In these 9 verses, we have a statement of physical deformities that prohibit someone from approaching God to offer sacrifices in the veil or near the altar. And these proscriptions have been generalized to all disability in all contexts from all contact with God. It is wrong to make this generalization. To read just a few verses earlier, we see in verse 1, then the Lord said to Moses, speak to the priests. I mentioned earlier that within the Holiness Code, there were a couple of chapters directed not at all of Israel, but specifically to the priests. This is one of those chapters. There is a specificity to this instruction that is important. These instructions are about ritual purity, and they are specifically for the priest offering sacrifices to God, and specifically this type of sacrifice, not all sacrifices. Furthermore, Baruch Levine offers a close examination of these instructions and notes the direct parallels of the purity of the priest with the instructions for the purity of the animal sacrifice. Levine notes, neither the priest nor sacrificial animal may be blind, have broken limbs, have scurvy, have a boil or scar, have limbs that are out of the ordinary, have crushed testes, or have a growth in the eye. While we may chafe at the limits placed on the person of the priest by the biblical text, there are many things to consider regarding why it put these limits on in the first place. First, gods in the ancient Near East were scary. And this includes the Israelites' early perceptions about Yahweh. There are numerous passages that reinforce Yahweh's nature as literally awesome in its original sense. So when sacrifices were offered to God or to the gods, the sacrifice itself must be considered perfect. Additionally, it was not always clear what would upset a god, and again, this includes Yahweh. So just to be careful, the priest should be perfect too. Leviticus seems to be writing, let us give God no reason to be upset in any way with the offering we present. As such, this passage is not actually about disability per se. It is rather about sacrifice, its perfect character, and the perfect performers and performance of the sacrifice. Now, I understand that this explanation of the text may raise different questions. So let us turn to our concluding section about the implications of all these issues that I have raised. To the scholar who wrote "The disabled are prohibited from God's presence," I respond, disability is not what is keeping you from God's presence in Leviticus. You aren't a priest, or you are unlikely to have been a priest in your critique. This was a set of instructions that were intended only for the Levitical family of priests for one kind of sacrifice in a particular context. This was not an instruction for all of Israel. This was part of the job description for this particular job and was not intended for everyone. All biblical passages are written in and depicted particular contexts that must be considered in their interpretation. Too many of the articles I've encountered on this topic read the text as if the entire Bible were flat. That is, as if the Bible speaks with a single voice from a single point in time to a context-free and timeless future. Leviticus was written, as thought by most scholars, between the 10th and 8th centuries BCE, after the establishments of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, after Israel's sociological move away from pastoral transhumans, that is, being nomads and sheep herders, towards a society that was more settled and agriculturally based. And this in turn allowed for the diversification of labor, including a dedicated priesthood. And thus, Leviticus is quite near the establishment of the priesthood as a dedicated profession. They were working it out. Since we have other scriptures that address ritualistic obedience of and fidelity to Yahweh that emphasize different aspects and procedures for worship, it seems obvious that had Leviticus been written at a different time, its own concerns would have been expressed differently. We must remember, for instance, that Leviticus does not envision mechanisms for worship that extend far beyond Jerusalem. That is, the entire apparatus for worship is centered in a specific place that does not account well for worship more than one day's journey from Jerusalem. This context shaped how they expressed the limits of what the authors of Leviticus considered the proper worship of Yahweh. I would like to return to the idea that I raised in concluding the section on Leviticus 21. I suggested that the instructions were not a comment on disability per se, but rather about the restrictions imposed upon the priest offering sacrifices. I think that this is true, but it raises a troubling question. Do such instructions then preclude people with disabilities now from acting in the equivalent role of priest or pastor? To which I would say, let us talk about the arcs of Scripture. Not arcs like Raiders of the Lost Ark, but arcs like curving lines. The Bible is not simply an answer book. It is a conversation between the people of God and God's self. It asks some questions, it answers some questions. But it is not simply a repository of answers. What do I mean by this? If we were to divide history with the biblical period as its centerpiece, we would have or could have 4 periods. The first period being the time before the Bible was written, during which people unquestionably encountered God. The second period would be the time during which the Hebrew Bible was written and being written. The third period being the New Testament period. And the fourth period being after the closing of the biblical canon. In each of those periods, several questions about God were raised, and occasionally those questions were answered in the same period. Sometimes answers had to wait to the next period or even later. Some examples. In the Hebrew Bible period, the question of what type of government should the Israelites have was asked and answered, perhaps in a few different ways. But the question was more or less settled. We shall have a theocracy centered on Yahweh as our metaphorical king, with a human king as God's representative. Asked and answered. A second example. From the Old Testament period, the nature of God was raised, and some answers were given, like, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." But a slightly different answer was given in the next time period, the New Testament period, which insisted that yes, God is one, but somehow this Jesus fellow also belongs in the conversation. And in fact, it wasn't until the next period, after the closing of the canon, that the idea of the Trinity was more clearly articulated. You can apply this to many theological questions and ideas where they were asked and answered, and we don't always get the answer we want in the same time period that the question was asked. I raise this idea because it is important to recognize that we see evidence of the people of God working out how to articulate how to be the people of God, how to understand God, and how to relate to God and others. We often look back and can be tempted to be critical of the biblical text because it is advocating for standards that do not match our modern sensibilities. In this case, that would be a modern criticism of the Bible's insistence that the priest be physically without blemish. But we fail to empathize with the efforts of those working out their salvation with fear and trembling. We fail to see what Leviticus offered was a step forward in the discussion and not inherently the end point. Finally, and I do not think it is insignificant to close with this detail. Years ago, the brilliant Jewish scholar Yehezkel Kaufman wrote a book titled The Religion of Israel, in which he explored Israel's religious identity and practice at great length and fine scholarly aplomb. Much more recently, we have been treated to scholarly explorations of the same, but titles are, for instance, by Richard Hess, Israelite religions, and by Zioni Zevet, the religions of ancient Israel. Both titles put the word religion in the plural. This is similar to how different denominations in modern expressions of Christianity do things with slight or significant differences. The significance of this is that any exploration in the biblical text is one of several ways in which religion was expressed in ancient Israel. There may have been dominant voices, but no voice, and certainly not Leviticus, had a monopoly on explaining Israel's religious life. To read the biblical texts requires balancing all these things, neither under nor over reading the text, keeping context and history in mind, recognizing that the ancient authors were often offering their best understanding of how to live faithfully in their time, whether or not that matches our modern sensibilities. And finally, recognizing that the God who inspired the Levitical writers to insist that all Israel ought to be holy because God's self is holy, is the same God who inspired Jesus of Nazareth to throw open access to God, to the blind, to the lame, and the paralyzed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cory. It was a very, very accurate and careful talk that respects both the content and the context of the Hebrew Bible, which is very commendable. So thank you very much for all the insight. And now we might have a Q&A session. And you, dear participants, you're all welcome to submit your questions in our chat so that we might read them, or you might raise your hand and directly voice it, and we hope that Cory will be able to answer them. And probably let me start with one question that I have in mind, and then we'll give some time to our participants to frame their thoughts. So I do respect this idea of balancing many things and reading text carefully, not overreading, not underreading. So my question would be about these two sets of texts. You basically highlighted that there are more like instructions for professional good practice codes, and also like the ethical advice. And I'm interested in your thoughts about the reception of this text in its original context. I mean, ancient Hebrew context, and sometime BCE. How do these two sets sound for the Israelites, especially in their background among the Canaanites or Babylon religion or ancient Egypt religions which surrounded the ancient Israel? So how did these instructions sound? How they were perceived? How did they differ, if at all, from the ethical or religious ideas around Israel? Could you comment on that?
Yes. The first part of your question, one part you asked was, how did the ancient Israelites respond to this? And I think Saul Olyon does talk about how in the ancient world, they did certainly value physical perfection or near perfection. People like Samson are glorified because he is strong and big. Saul as well is thought of as a good representative because of his charisma and physical prowess. So when I offer some sort of nuanced take from a perspective 2,000-3,000 years later, I'm not suggesting that I would be in concert with an ancient Israelite interpretation. I think many of them would receive this list and think, that's right, of course you should not have a person with any sort of defect offer sacrifices to God. But again, I think that needs to be said in its context of especially being scared of gods. They're big and scary. That's part one. Part two is the idea that the Israelites often utilized material or ideas from the surrounding cultures. So we do have a lot of material from the Assyrians and Babylonians, Hittites and Egyptians about how a priest should be and perform and act in the world. And some of it looks similar to this. The difference, according to some commentators, and I rely heavily on Milgram on this interpretation, is that what Leviticus does differently is that it inherently ties ethics to purity. So whereas in ancient Babylon and Egypt, a priest, if they were following the purity laws, they could perform the religious rites. And that was completely separate from their ethical behavior. They could be bad people as long as they did what was right ritualistically. And Milgram insists that Leviticus is trying to tie ritualistic holiness to ethical holiness so that the priest does have to be ritualistically pure, but must also be ethically pure. And part of opening that whole conversation to all of Israel is for all of Israel to adhere to that, but also so that they might hold the priest accountable to the standards that are necessary. And so I find that even in ritualistic practices, Israel does what it so often does. It borrows from their neighbors, but puts their little spin on it that is typically Yahwistic. It is typically about fidelity to Yahweh, and it is about not just looking like we are doing this, but like internally all the way through being ethical and pure.
Good. Thank you very much. Also, we see a comment, reflection from Alex, and I'll probably read it. Arguably, like the saying, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. As I have a scar on my face and multiple disability issues, some institutions seek to rule me out of them. But is this oppressive or liberating? Do I fight it or ignore it? Becoming a vagabond in the wilderness is a rich blessing. Learning to ignore the institutions and take the holy into the wild irritates and disempowers the institution, celebrating new forms of Eucharist with dirty hands and broken bodies, drinking nice non-alcoholic energy drink, and smashing motherboard of computers can be new unity, and through parody we change reality. I'm not commenting on my deformed genitals or the Olympic opening ceremony. So, very interesting comment. Cory, would you like to, I don't know, reflect on what Alex is saying?
I was immediately struck by the notion, and perhaps somebody will talk about this later in one of the other talks, but I think we must be reminded that one, disability you can be born with it or you can acquire it. As we mentioned, like Isaac becomes blind in his old age. But our best example, of course, is Jesus becomes, in many ways, what some would call disabled by his crucifixion. He gains wounds in his hands and feet that permanently compromise the way he moves in his body. And with Jesus being such and still participating in the holy life, I personally cannot see a way in which we would preclude people with disability from participating in the worship of God. And so I can appreciate this. On the surface, this might sound like one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. I think scars and disability should remind us immediately of Jesus. And so that is that is my take right there.
Great reflection. Thank you for connecting with Jesus Christ. And also there's a question of Andrei Shved from Kiev, who kind of also connects the Old Testament with the New, but it's framed a little more provocatively. So the question sounds, why there is such a gap between the Old Testament and the New? Why people with disabilities are so oppressed in the Old Testament? Or you think there is no gap?
I think this is a very good question. I think there is a gap. I would acknowledge that there is a gap. I don't know if I can explain entirely why there is such a gap, but I do believe that certain things change in between what happens in the writing of early Hebrew scriptures versus New Testament writings. There is a sea change in the world and in the Israelites, who by the time of the New Testament are no longer even considered Israelites. They have changed as a people. They have gone into and out of exile, and they have had to deal with oppressive regimes for a long time. I think perhaps their worldview changed a little bit. We should also be reminded, I think, that Jesus himself is not representing the dominant worldview in the New Testament. What Jesus is saying when he accepts the blind and the lame is revolutionary. So perhaps there's not as much of a gap as I initially started this comment on, that there is something of a continuity between the way people perceived people with disability. Right? Jesus asked that question, right? Was this man who was born blind, is it his fault or is it his parents' fault? So he's clearly addressing this kind of dominant worldview that there's still a stigma that should be attached to disability. So perhaps there's less of a gap than I even thought at the beginning. Yeah.
Thank you. And the other question that we have also kind of continues the topic. It sounds, what can you say about the social norms and cultural perceptions in the Old Testament based on the attitudes toward people with disabilities at that time? And how would you compare the social environment in which people with disabilities lived in the Old and New Testament?
These are really good questions, and I am very grateful for them. I'm going to take a sidetrack for half a second. One of my favorite passages is Judges 5. And Judges 5 is known as the Song of Deborah. And it begins with this idea that Deborah was a judge, and it goes on to explain her exploits in fighting off surrounding Canaanites. And one of the things I have often said about this passage is that the fact that Deborah, a woman, was a judge was unremarkable because it was in the biblical text unremarked upon. That is, the biblical text did not feel a notion it necessary to call out that Deborah was a woman and a judge. She simply was a judge. I recognize that Judges 4 does remark about the fact that she was a mother in Israel, etc. But for me, the earlier text being Judges 5 is so remarkable because it doesn't make a big deal about her being a female judge. Now, put that back into the context of disability. So many of the heroes that we encounter do have, that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, do have some manner of disability. And in many cases, it was not something particularly that precluded them from social interactions and social status. And it was in many ways unremarked upon. So I think perhaps there might have been a wide range of reaction to disability in ancient Israel, some level of acceptance, probably some stigmatization. And the real stigmatization came when it came to ritualistic performance in the cult of Yahweh, the actual apparatus of running the places where they did the sacrifice. I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that's where I'm immediately drawn to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, we also have a new question from Valentina. Valentina, would you like to voice it yourself because you're here, or should I read it?
Sure. Hi, thank you for the class. And my question is on Psalms 105:37, where it says that actually while Israel was in the desert for 40 years, there were no sick people among them. Have you ever studied this period of time, and any thoughts on that? Because we don't have any, if they were healthy, it means there were no handicap, no disabled, no. So I was just curious if you studied this period.
What a very good question. I have studied some of this time period, and I think my answer starts from the premise of how do I read and interpret the Bible in general. And so first, when it comes to Psalms, I'm reminded that Psalms is wonderful and somewhat unique in the biblical text in that it is primarily the voice of the people reflecting back to God. So this is less about God speaking to people like in prophecy, and it's less about people talking about history. But this is an opportunity to speak to God. And oftentimes, the rhetoric of prayer and psalms and praise is full of what might be considered hyperbole. So I would be a little reluctant to accept this statement as a perhaps true and literal detail of what it was like in the wilderness, and more a sense of a generalized people were not feeble because of your sustenance, God, and so we celebrate you for that. And that's where I would begin with that sort of that notion. There is a sense, I think, that we see in all texts, and no less in the biblical text, of the memory of people who record a text, right? Cultural memory is a little bit about what people remember, but it's equally about what people forget. So when we read about the Exodus in the texts in Torah, we read a lot about how much complaining there was, how upset they were with their leaders, how they really kind of wanted to go back to Egypt. And we get a take that might be, you might say, raw and real. But by the time we get to the recorded Psalms that we have, there might be a little cultural forgetfulness in the sense of we can forget that because we have come to a place where we can stop and celebrate God. And so that we at least temporarily set aside the memories of struggle and complaining that existed in the wilderness. So that's more for me about like how I would read the text, and my thought that it's perhaps a little bit of hyperbole.
Okay, but it looks like it's God's response in spite of their decision, even though because God was leading them and was providing. But thank you. I understood your point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cory. Also, we have another question from Paul Yap. And Paul, are you here? Could you ask it yourself?
Sorry, I try to express as closely as possible. Basically, we all trying to find out the intended meaning of the author in the biblical books. So in order to do that, I was thinking that is it possible that the Jewish interpretation over the centuries of this particular older Jewish book, Leviticus, throw some lights to our understanding of what is the purpose of all these ritual requirements. So I was led to believe that some Dead Sea Scroll and some later Jewish literature do have something to say about this particular passage. So what is your opinion on that, or rather on that approach in understanding the intended meaning of these Leviticus passages?
Thank you. You raise a very important point. The early interpretation of Levitical passages, for instance, at Qumran. Qumran is a very fascinating community. And one of the things they are known for is, I want to be careful how I say this, but they were rigorous, and some might even say almost extreme in the way in which they defined their community and their insistence upon purity. And so while I did not explore this particular trajectory from Leviticus to Qumran, it would no doubt, in my mind, they would interpret this very literally, very prescribing anyone with disabilities from participation in the formal ritual aspects of worship. That would not surprise me at all. Early rabbinic interpreters, I believe you will find, had a variety of interpretations. And having said that, I would agree that the majority would lean towards quite literal interpretations that would be consonant with the Qumranic interpretation. I do believe, that Leviticus 19:14, for instance, is talking literally about the deaf and the blind. But I also believe that they are meant to be representative of all people. So it's not to suggest that this is simply metaphorical, that they're metaphorically deaf or metaphorically blind. It does mean literal blindness, but it's not trying to be exhaustive in the list of who exists there. When it comes to the ritual participation, that's where I think we find the most clear example of why people with disabilities should be precluded according to the Levitical law, and that is about sacrifice, and rather than about generally someone with disability. If you look earlier in Leviticus, there are two primary types of sacrifice: the olah and the shalamim sacrifices. And in each case, the person is allowed to bring the animal or the grain to the priest to do it. And I believe they're supposed to lay their hand upon it so that the beast, for instance, will kind of, through a transitive property, like the guilt goes from the person to the animal. And there's no prescription on the person about their defects. So a person with disability could participate in that part of the ceremony. And then it was kind of turned over to the professionals who were the ones to offer the sacrifice, and they were supposed to have this job description. So I want to be very clear that I don't think Leviticus was suggesting that it was like okay to be disabled, because they had a very particular reason why they thought it was not. But I also think that there are some caveats to understand why they thought that, and why perhaps with more reflection, both theological and as we develop as a society, we may not agree exactly with those prescriptions.
Thanks, thanks.
Thank you both. And also Sarah Payne asked the question. So Sarah, would you like to voice it yourself?
I guess what I'm interested in is understanding, as we've talked through this list in terms of disabilities, the relationship between Leviticus 21 and Jesus as great high priest.
Thank you, Sarah, for bringing up this nice connection. I think I would simply reiterate that Jesus caused massive reinterpretation of biblical passages and caused us to see everything in a new light. And so for me, I think it's kind of as simple as that. Jesus kind of says, yes, those were the rules. And yet here I am offering something that is bigger and better, and a reason for us to look differently at those passages. Because here I am the great high priest, and I have what many would call disability. And yet here I go. That's my take on that. I find that one really compelling, that Jesus is just upending so many things without dismissing it too. Just reinterpreting.
Great. Thank you. We still have time for a couple of more questions. And oh, we've got one. It's in the chat, but Ksenia, would you ask it yourself?
Yeah, that's a more practical question because I know that you are serving in different communities and churches for a long period of time with your wife, Emmy Jacober. And that's interesting. What is the situation in the churches? So I want to move from maybe Hebrew Bible to more practical sphere. Because visiting for some time American churches, I never really heard some sermons on something like that. So it's interesting, what is the situation when people try to preach on this kind of the topics? Do they change their approach, trying to rethink the message of the Bible, or trying to find this like kind of the middle position, not over-reading and not under-reading the Bible? Because also the situation in Ukraine, that sometimes we understand that even some ministers and preachers, they often do not have this feeling that very diverse audience may be listening to them, and you have to prepare your message for the very diverse people to build this space of acceptability, of acceptance, inclusion, and yeah. So it's more practical question.
Yeah, I think that's a good insight that you seeded within your question. I think what I have seen is that the idea of disability ministries is something that has grown in the last 40, maybe 50 years. I'm reminded of a ministry known as Young Life Capernaum, which began in the early 1980s in the United States. And that's Young Life, which many of you may know, but Capernaum part is Young Life for kids with disabilities. And it grew slowly and it took time, and eventually it became a very large ministry in the United States. I see many churches and denominations starting to do things like disability ministries. So on the one hand, I see this growing concern for the disability community and the church's response to it. On the other side, I do not see a lot of discussion from the pulpit on this topic. And I can't always explain why that is, but I will say this. My wife and I taught at a seminary for a number of years, and many of our students who became pastors and went out into the field, as they were leaving, they were filled with, I'm going to go and say the right thing because the people need to hear it, whatever topic that was on. And within several years, we would often hear back from them and they would say, I can't say the things I want to say because everybody gets mad at any time I deviate from a narrow set of ideas. And so I'm kind of constricted in what is acceptable in my congregation. And it's hard. So from the pulpit, there seems to be a lot of the same kinds of messages that we've heard for years. It seems like the avenue for getting these ideas out there is not primarily from the pulpit, but kind of on the side conversations and with people to encourage them to think in different ways and to express inclusivity in the population and their participation in the population. So I see more, and I also see kind of a mainstream effect that still resides in the sermons themselves.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
Thank you. There is also Ben Watson with his question. So I would like to ask Ben to turn on his mic and probably voice it.
I just want to point out and get your comment that this restriction was not what was only on offering sacrifices, and probably for practical reasons, because of having to lift them and that kind of thing, which would be difficult for people with the disabilities that are mentioned in the Leviticus 21 passage. However, it does not prohibit a disabled person, and I take this from silence more than anything else, from participating in other activities of the priesthood. So it seems to me that the only things they were prohibited from was the offering, but they were not prohibited from the worship, and certainly not from God's presence, as you pointed out with your story. And I appreciated that quote. Thank you for sharing that. I also just want to point out one other thing, and that is that there's not a whole lot of talk in any of the things I've read and listened to, and I'm very lately come to this discipline that disabled people can actually participate in ministry, and there's not a lot of encouragement. We're focusing on the care of the disabled, but we're not focusing on continuing on from the care of the disabled to the ministry of the disabled. So, okay, those are my two comments, and I'll let you comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. One of the wonderful things about the biblical text is it often works on multiple levels. And I believe, I'm inclined to think that because of the specific prescriptions that are put on the priest and how closely they match the prescriptions of the sacrificial animal, that's the parallel that I find most compelling to me. But it can simultaneously be about the idea of whether or not they were capable of performing the sacrifice. My wife mentions that it can be hard for a person who does not have, hands to offer communion and physically deliver the host or hold the cup. Not impossible, but it becomes a certain challenge that would not have been conceptualized in the ancient world. And so sometimes these things can work on different levels. Thinking of like dietary restrictions in the Bible, there seems to be on the surface little rhyme or reason to some of the dietary prescriptions, but some studies have suggested that a lot of the things that Jews are prohibited from eating are less healthier than some of the other options they had. It kind of can work on two levels. That's the first part. The second is, you are correct, I think, that a lot of the focus has been on care for people with disabilities, but I believe that's changing. There are an increasing number of persons with disabilities who are speaking at conferences and able to participate in full-time ministry. While, like I said, this is not my wheelhouse, I am tangentially connected to a lot of these conversations through my wife. And I've seen a number of people with disabilities who participate in actual ministry and not just on the receiving end of that. And so I find that to be encouraging. Is it enough? Probably not, but I do think that the tide is turning.
Thank you. I guess I have another question while we still have time. So, Cory, well, in your talk, you kind of mentioned, or you explained two perspectives on the text, that, I mean, more ethical and more priestly. And I'm curious to ask, well, here in Leviticus, we mostly hear the voice of the priests or of leaders of God's people. But how do you think, are there in the Old Testament also other voices, maybe the voices of the disabled? Maybe some Psalms, I don't know, like 12 or 13 that talk about seeking refuge in God and the needy people. Do you think that there are any voices of the disabled heard in the Hebrew Bible? And if there are they in Psalms, or where we should find them?
Great question. I don't know of a place where we hear the voice of the disabled explicitly in the Hebrew Bible texts. You mentioned Psalm 13. I think, while not a person who is explicitly labeled as a person with disabilities, this is a person who is experiencing great discomfort and sadness, and in the midst of all of that still finds a way to worship God. I think that's a very important psalm worthy of consideration. Regarding the explicit voice of the disabled, I cannot think of a place where that is. So.
Okay, so thank you. Are there any other questions left? We still have a few minutes, so feel free to frame it or to pose.
Yeah, rather than just spend my time typing it, I thought I'd just voice it out. Yeah. Sorry, I can't put my picture up because my line is very unstable. So to yeah, I want to ask you, if I get it correctly, on your approach to the Leviticus, you are starting with two of the assumptions or presupposition or starting point. One is that you reckon that the Leviticus is more like a ethical genre rather than legal, and that will kind of dictate how you interpret that particular injunctions. Those few injunctions. It's more like ethical rather than a legalistic prescription. The second thing I can notice is that you tend to of the opinion that Leviticus is written more of a later stage or later period than the early period. Am I correct to understand it? I mean,
you are correct, but I'll add a little caveat. The injunctions that Leviticus puts out there are of two types. One is the ritualistic, and I believe those are much more rigid. They bear a more striking resemblance to legal material than the ethical portions. But the ethical portions of Leviticus, I would suggest, is much more about guidance for living rather than you must do the following or must not do the following. That bears a little more resemblance to specifically religious and ethical proverbs. So I agree that, like, the holiness code is by and large more ethical advice, but there are certainly portions of Leviticus that are more like legal material, and that's the stuff that usually deals with the ritual purity injunctions. The second part is, I'm convinced that P is a slightly later dating than others. I mentioned Yehezkel Kaufman. He is one of the early proponents for a very early P source, where P is, in his estimation, I believe as early as the 12th century, all the way down to the 10th, whereas more recently, some see P as 8th century or even later. Some would put it in the 6th. I do not have a firm date in mind, but I am convinced that it is certainly later than it is after the beginning of the monarchy. That would be my my argument.
Yeah, thanks. What about the first question, just a little bit more. Would you rely on the modern genre theory to help you determine whether it's ethical or legal genre? Or does the modern genre theory throw some light on your decisions on that?
Can I have you repeat that question? I wanna be sure I heard you correctly.
There's this theory called modern genre theory, but to be sure that that theory is more like applicable, or people apply it to the New Testament scholarship lah. But I would just want to know your take on whether the modern genre theory helps you to decide whether it's an ethical theory or ethical literature or a legalistic literature for all those Leviticus injunction.
Right. I think I hear you now.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's the way I would like to answer that, which is that I believe that these genres exist whether or not we have these modern theories about how to understand them. That is, I don't believe in that we only recognize these texts as certain genres because we have a new modern theory for explaining the contours of given genres. In the ancient world, they followed genre ideas, even if they didn't have a theory articulating it. That is,
sure.
Right, exactly. They knew how to write a letter, they knew how to write laws, they knew how to write history, and all those things took different forms. And they recognized them and followed those forms and norms in their writing. And so the fact that in the modern times we have articulated with specificity how to differentiate these norms doesn't kind of preclude the fact that they already existed. So when I look at the Holiness Code and I say, this looks like ethical advice, I'm saying that's because it looks like the ethical advice that is given elsewhere in the ancient Near East.
Okay. Comparative study.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But the second question about your P-source, is it related to this what you call documentary hypothesis, or is it a more revised version of it, or
the P source? Okay. P is related to the documentary hypothesis, which is like from the kind of finally articulated by Julius Wellhausen in 1880. And that kind of has a nice run for about 100 years before people start kind of undermining the hypothesis. So I don't rely on it for my explanation of the text, but I try to utilize it because it is a common framework that people utilize in understanding who wrote which parts of Torah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for making it clear. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I think we have had a great discussion, and also thanks Alex for sharing your insights. And probably, I think Amy Jacober asks the last question that we might wish to answer, Cory, because it's a very interesting one about the arc and the dynamics of Scripture. So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
The arcs of Scripture. To be clear, Amy Jacober is my wife, and I think she's just pushing me here. So can I talk a little bit more about the arcs of Scripture? Yeah. I think what she is asking me to articulate is this. The Hebrew Bible was written over almost 1,000-year period of time. And so there, as I mentioned, questions asked and answered, some within the Old Testament and some only answered later in the New Testament or post-canonical time period. But in general, one of the arcs we see within the Hebrew Bible is this general widening of acceptance of who is God's people. It really starts with Abraham, this one guy from one place, and it expands to his family, and then it expands to like a wider conception of Israel. I'll go back to Judges 5, which I've mentioned previously. Judges 5, there's some discussion about who is in and who is out of Israel and whether or not they should be. From there, it kind of expands to who is holy, which is firstly the priesthood and then all of Israel. And then this opens the door that allows us to expand into the New Testament where Gentiles are allowed to be part of the family of God. And so I think that's part of what she's asking me to articulate here. And that's one of the arcs of Scripture, is the general widening of acceptance into the family of God.
That's a great answer and a great perspective. So thank you very much for a very insightful talk. I would like to ask all our participants to applaud and to thank our speaker for his wonderful lecture. It was really great to hear you talk about these topics. So thank you very much. And I think here we finally press on pause.